race, sports, gender, the business world have all intersected again, here at KU as well as outside. And we have Beth Llewellyn with us, who is coming from the 1970s, grew up in Lawrence, born and raised here, and has recently returned back to Lawrence. But also she was a sport athlete, was a track and field hurdler, but also was a field hockey athlete as well, which many people don't remember that KU had field hockey, and which I think will also enter the discussion as well. Also was here with the implementation of Title IX and what that meant for women's sports here at KU, how that benefited and also changed and different things as well. We have Dr. Eric Patterson. This is the second time Eric has been on our panel, and this is the first time I get to say Dr. Eric Patterson. So I'm very pleased to do that. Eric was with us on our first year of this when we had crazily had 6 or 7 panelists. It was a lot, is really what it was. And so we're pleased to have him back here. Eric comes out of California, Long Beach, California, and I think he'll talk to us a little bit about that. Also a two-sport athlete here at the University of Kansas, where he was, again, a track and field athlete and a hurdler. So we have 2 hurdlers with us today. And then we was also a football player. And I think both of those will be interesting conversations and discussing differences between the 2 sports. I think both of them, the differences between 2 sports, also the differences between Beth's experience as a track and field athlete versus Eric's experience as a track and field athlete, 20 years apart. Race also playing into that, gender playing into that, and then Eric's discussion again with the football team in the 90s. So just to pose a question, because Eric's on my left, immediate left, I'm going to ask you the first question, then we'll go through. So what was it like coming to Lawrence, Kansas from Long Beach, California? Long Beach, California in the 90s to Lawrence, Kansas?
Needless to say, it was a shock. A little bit different here in Lawrence, Kansas from Long Beach at the time. At the time, Long Beach, California was heavily into gangs, lots of killings, lots of violence. And first off, I'd like to say rest in peace to a friend I just lost yesterday, Leland Matthews. Still violence going on there today. But the biggest difference for me was the people. Not even the landscape, it was the people. No one looked like me. So it was a big change in just my daily being. I used to go to school, used to wake up, see people around me, be comfortable with people around me. I was accepted. And then I got here and I was an outcast. I was a football player. I was big and black, and so I must have played a sport. So it was always a constant battle to exist as not just a football player, not just a track person, but to exist as someone that now lives in Kansas and that's from California and is trying to be accepted, that wants to be a student, that wants to be someone that can excel in business, someone that wants to be a good friend, all of these different identities that I was experiencing being away from home. It was a smack in the face, to say the least.
And Beth, growing up in Lawrence in the late 1960s, early 70s, and then coming to the university that was at your doorstep. So, and being an athlete and the changes that were going on for women in sports at that time. So what was that like?
Even to kind of put this in a lens 20 years earlier in Lawrence with what it was like for Eric coming in the 90s. So for me, back then, nobody was recruiting me to play sports. Nobody was recruiting women in the 70s. And I never thought about, seriously, going anywhere to school but KU. So, as Eric and I even talked to get ready today, and we're on K Club's board together, so he's gotten to be an adulthood friend through K Club. And we learned something about one another new all the time. But so that's even interesting for me to think about. So I never thought about going anywhere else. Nobody was recruiting me. And I came here, and the sport I played that I perhaps excelled in was a sport that I'd never played before, but a high school coach said, I think you'd like this sport. So and I stayed in my hometown where the vast majority of people looked like me, in the safety of the home I grew up in, because my parents bought the house we had, so you could go to grade school, junior high, walk to high school, walk to college. So very, very different than someone walking away from their own home. And also different, experiencing that in that time as a young woman. So I was thrilled to finally get to play sports because we didn't have sports until my senior year in college or high school, where you actually even got to compete. So I grew up thinking, going back much younger, if I were a boy, you did the sports that were available to you, and track was a biggie because of Junior Olympics. So I didn't have the leaving home, and I have to confess that there's no way I would have lettered in track today. So it was not nearly as competitive, and it was more about just the opportunity.
So bouncing off that then, Eric, let's talk a little bit more about that recruiting process and the recruiting process. We have talked before about the importance of Coach Mitchell, and Coach Mitchell being an individual that kind of assured you everything would be okay. Yeah. So what was that recruiting process like?
It was nice to have someone that looked like me recruiting me. Mm-hmm. It was nice to hear him reassure me to let me know that I could succeed once I got to a place like KU, a predominantly white institution. But those words, they were nice initially, but it was more of my grandmother pushing me out of California because I needed to get away from the drug violence. I needed to get away from the gang violence. I needed to live. So getting away was something that had to happen. And once I got here, there's ups and downs with recruiting and just being at an institution such as this. Once I got here, I wanted to leave within the first 3 days. I didn't want to be here. But my grandmother, her words, they live with me forever. She said, if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. You can do anything in life. Because you're going to encounter people that don't look like you, that don't have the same views as you, that can help you change and become a better person. So I stayed. Dino Bell was also a very influential person in my life, being a mentor for me, being a former student athlete himself here at the University of Kansas. So having people like that in your life at an institution such as this is very important. Part of that recruiting process, we talk about socialization all the time. We talk about, as a young boy, I was told, you're going to play football, you're going to play sports. Got to middle school, you're going to play sports. Got to high school, you're going to play sports. People always recognize you for your sports and not for your other accomplishments that you've achieved throughout life, academic or just personal. And the same thing happened here. You get on campus and you must play sports. And then, and we've discussed this before, you get to the locker room, and in 1996, and you have a locker room that is divided by race, self-imposed. And for me, a young 18-year-old, you're coming in thinking that things are different. You're coming in thinking that, this is 1996, I'm in Kansas, things are going to be safe. And then you walk into that environment, and again, you don't know what to do. So now you're confused again with what your role is and how you're going to succeed in such a place as this, where you think you're safe, but you have segregation in your own locker room. And you have coaches that see this, but don't acknowledge it. You have teammates that see this and just continue it. So one of the things that went through my mind was, how long has this been going on? Because it didn't happen, it was already in place when I got there. So, why is it still going on? How is this still going on? And it didn't change. I didn't do anything to change it, so I didn't help the situation. But it just made me wonder. It made me hesitant of being accepting of being here. But somehow, some way, persevered.
I mean, that's we've talked about that before. And it's always been an amazing story to me, right? Because it's not what we expect. That we're sitting here in 1996, and you're walking into a locker room, and it's self-imposed, as you say, but accepted by the team, and very few people stepping up to respond to it, just accepting that that's what it is. That's the culture of the team.
There was a few people that crossed the lines, but very few. It was just accepted as what it was.
Right. So, very good. Beth, again, with you, how did Title IX affect you, or do you think it affected you necessarily?
No.
Were you aware of it?
No, I actually was aware of it, and there were seniors who were on the class that you were around that were involved in women's sports, that had been in the conversations and knew of professors and others who had been in the conversations doing kind of the heavy lifting, talking about things that should be different. And in that regard, when you went on a trip, so in field hockey, this is back in the Big 8, it wasn't the Big 12, you didn't travel and get to play against everyone because you didn't have the money to get that far. Colorado didn't come here. We managed to play most of the folks right here in the Midwest. There were folks with teams that didn't come. So the travel just wasn't what it was. I don't know what it's like today, but we'd have 4 girls in a room for hotel travel. Everybody drove. There weren't team buses that were rented. You had cars or the trainers. I actually had one time, one of the things that was different, and I think it's how we are today, but the track, when I ran track, we actually were with the men's team. So the men's coaches were the women's coaches. I think my freshman year that might not have been the case, but the other years it was. So you got to travel with the guys. And so I know even those coaches, I sat next to Coach Timmons on a trip in a car to a duo, so folks drove. But we just didn't have the money. You didn't have warm-ups. You felt fortunate to get to play. So the notion of, if you let me play, which was kind of even a theme in the 90s, and all the positive impacts for women, that if you let me play sport, I'm less likely to have breast cancer. I'm less likely to be depressed if you let me play. So our biggest thing was about the gratitude to finally get to play. But I wore my letter jacket today because these weren't given to us. I have a letter jacket because a sister gave it to me for Christmas one year. So I have a watch. I don't get to do this with the rings. I think I could buy one, but they weren't given to us back then. We didn't even have the richness of the K Club that celebrated and did traditions. But so today I wore a watch that absolutely cannot be fixed. I've tried to several times. But the one thing I'll say to you, even back then, so when women's sports became more prevalent, the 1 year a watch was given, because we kept trying to figure out, what do we want to do? What do we do with our little bits of dollars? We sexualized the Jayhawk. So it has a skirt. The Jayhawk's in a skirt. I don't think we do that any longer with school masks. I know we don't do it with the Jayhawk. The Wildcats, I don't know if we have any folks that are from Manhattan. We were always the Jayhawks, or the Lady Jayhawks, but they were the Wild Kittens. Ooh. So anyway, so it was more stuff around how do we figure out this women getting to be playing and doing things like everyone else. So I always felt fortunate that track was with men and women, and you practiced together. It wasn't like they get off the track, then we get the track. We got to do all that together back then. So those are actually fond memories around track time. But that's, if that helps.
Very good. And Eric, how about the difference between the two sports, between track and field and football, and in particular, right? You're in a particular type of track, right?
Well, track and
Track can
field.
isolate themselves even more, right? Come into sections.
Yeah, track and field was a lot different than football, being that I thought that track athletes were a lot more open, a lot more forgiving, a lot more accepting, if that makes sense. We had our silos, but we were partitioned off by events. Now, we were also partitioned off by most African Americans were sprinters. It's just what it was. You had some multi-event people, you had some jumpers, but a lot of us were put together based on just our events. Not a lot of us did distance. I was not going anywhere near distance.
Nor was I.
Sprints, straight ahead.
You had barriers, though.
We had barriers, but they were easy. But track and field was, I felt like, I mean, you go back in history, and you look at Jesse Owens, and you look at all these great people that participated in the field of track and in the sport of track and field, the pioneers that paved the way for us. They just made it that much easier because people idolized them. So once we got to track practice, everyone just came together. There wasn't so much separation. Even when we were outside of practice, people lived together, people hung out together, people actually liked each other. Whereas on the football team, the black players hung out, the white players hung out. Very, very little did we come together to hang out. Because when we did come together, let's say if it was at a fraternity house, a fight was going to break out. It was inevitable because they didn't want us there. They told us they didn't want us there. They used words that they shouldn't use, but they used because they wanted to fight. Now, I'm not going to say we were innocent because we did the exact same thing. We were hyped up on testosterone and playing football all the time, always being violent with one another. Once we got off the football field, we still wanted to be violent, unfortunately. So we did our part to not help things, but I really wish we had something like you all have now in that having Rise. I think if we had something like that, something where we could come together as student athletes, but also go on campus and work with other students that aren't athletes. If we were able to go to them, if we were to have that organization, I think a lot of frustration would have been expelled. Yeah, so football, lots of silos, there wasn't any hidden hate. If someone didn't like you, they'd let you know. So I did appreciate that aspect of the racism, if you can appreciate something like that. But very different in that regard.
I mean, you said before, and I want to come back and say something about Rise, but you said before that you had a person that you said had openly white supremacist views and didn't hide them. No. And your idea was basically, I know who you are, I'm going to stay away from you, but the fact that that is being interacted between two teammates, right? Or at least a teammate towards another group on the team, and openly done. Again, KU's not unique in that. Just getting someone to sit here and talk about that is, I think, an eye-opening experience, right? So, and Rise, I think, is an amazing thing that they've created here. I think that it's a unique thing. Is it 4 years old, 3 years old? 3. So it's 3 years old, and I think that it's student-driven, right? Which I think is even more important, that it's student-driven to work and create this space, and I think they've done wonderful things with it. And Jane's office in the weeds, I think they've done a good job pushing it. And it's a wonderful thing. The students always have come back and talked about the importance of it. So I echo that. But that leads me to another question. And Beth talked about this a little bit by the travel and the possible not interaction with some teams. But what was the interaction with other teams like within still the Big 8, right? Still the Big 8 in '96, right?
Which within track and field, the interactions were great. They were always fun. Wherever we went, we always ran and partied.
Yeah. Okay.
We were college kids.
Right.
But the other teams, we all came together. Once we were on the track, you competed. Mm-hmm. Off the track, everyone intermingled. I don't know if that was everyone's experience, but it was my experience. Sure. Whether it be white, black, Asian, Puerto Rican, whoever, everyone interacted, and they did so in a polite manner. It was fun. Football, it was a business trip. Not to say that track wasn't. Track was just a lot more independent, a lot more trusting, I guess. Sure. Whereas in football, it was a business trip. You went, you got to where you were going, you had your meals, you had your pre-practices, you played the game, you got out of there.
I guess my question is more when you were on the field with the other teams, what was the interaction with other teams? Could you see the same type of what you're describing that exists on a KU team? Would you see that being played out on the field by opposing teams? You don't have to name them or name the people, but could you understand what I mean?
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily see it on the field played out by, but I heard it from guys that I played high school ball with.
Sure.
So I knew that KU wasn't unique in that aspect. I knew what was going on around the country within the Big 12. Had a lot of friends from Nebraska to Colorado to UCLA to Clemson. It was going on everywhere, just in different doses, so to speak.
Yeah.
So no, KU was not unique in that.
Yeah, sure, good. I guess I was trying to get it, and I'm not pushing you for an answer, but I'm just trying to explain it a little bit. I was saying if there was regional differences as well, right? KU isn't a unique thing that you go north and you go south, right? With the playing in the Big 12, and if whether or not there was differences going into Oklahoma, Texas, versus going up to Iowa State, or if it was universal. But that's more my mind running where these things could go, right?
The only place that comes to mind is Missouri, and I just don't like that.
Yeah.
You know.
I didn't mention Missouri for a reason, so I expected that to be the answer. So, but very good. Just to tell a little side that I've told many people, the very interesting thing, this takes us way back in history, but as we well know, KU didn't always allow African Americans to be in their sporting events, and there's a great event, a great moment in 1916 where Nebraska has their first black football player, and KU's student body at the time, probably about 100 black students, all go up to Lincoln and sit on the Lincoln side, wearing red, cheering for Nebraska's football team that day, rather than in protest. And the only reason we actually know that story is because it was covered by W.E.B. Du Bois in the Crisis magazine, because it was such a shock. But you have the majority of the black student body getting in cars and driving up to Lincoln, taking the 3 hours to drive up to Lincoln to sit on the opposing side to cheer for the other team, which is telling, right? And the experience that they were having. So, and that will continue really in the 20s, 30s, and forward at KU in a discussion of the experiences that the students are having and what they're challenging. Because the other schools in the Big 8, right, Big 6, they begin to add African American players, and KU doesn't. And KU is not unique, again, in it, but it's a slower process here as it is in other places. And there are places that are faster, and the students at those other institutions begin to recognize that and push for that, so, which is a fun little fact. I didn't mean to bring it down on everyone. Everyone got quiet on that. So, with, again, Beth, maybe with you on talking about field hockey and track and field, and you see the differences between those two. Did you see the differences between the other sports and what you were doing, or were you really in that mindset that you had said before, that you're kind of in your silo, you're just happy you're participating? So.
Yeah, I didn't go to the other sports. I was a pretty classic. I went to football games and basketball games, and I don't remember supporting other women's team sports, and had other interests, so I wasn't around them much.
Right, very good. And Eric, same question for you. Did you see similarities or differences between the other sports? Did you interact with people on the other sports?
Yeah, we definitely interacted with other sports, a lot with basketball. We interacted with pretty much all the sports, and all the female sports seem to be light years ahead of the male sports, from my perspective at least. I don't know if that were true, but that's just my perception of what.
You mean in social interaction?
Social interactions with all sports, with themselves, within their sport, and then also with male sports. But yeah, I didn't see. I saw a lot of thinking football, basketball, track and field. I saw a lot of the young men battling. Maybe not so much basketball because they were celebrities, but a lot of the young men struggling with who they were, on campus, trying to find that individuality, trying to find friends that weren't athletes. With the other sports, baseball, your other sports that were not predominantly black, I think they were just, they felt comfortable, so they didn't have to interact, or if they didn't want to, because they were already accepted.
You know, what I would say, again, it's the difference of 20 years earlier in the 70s, but the whole social supports, academic supports, some of the things that bring inter-sport together, those were non-existent in women's sport. I don't know if they were doing that either through academic supports or development or leadership development in men's sports at the time, but again, that was just non-existent in women. We were fortunate to have a food allowance and get to go play. I mean, that was, you provided your own shoes. You had a team uniform, but it was just, so what we certainly see, and Eric and I both see, and Eric's referenced it, that's so wonderful about through our sports teams and the supports for those students, and those students even being leaders on the campus for change and these kind of conversations, that just wasn't there in the 70s in women's sports at all.
So I've got a couple more questions, but I want to open it up. We're about at 40 after the hour, so I want to make sure that we have time for questions from the audience, and if we can bring it back if we don't. So we have microphones coming around, so if you have a question, please raise your hand, and we will bring a microphone to you.
I'm just curious, between the two genders and the 20-year difference, when did your professors know you were an athlete, and do you think they treated you differently as an athlete than an average student would have been treated in terms of expectations, what they thought you should be doing?
My professors didn't even know I was probably an athlete. Any conversation I had was I actually also played on I was in the orchestra. So in terms of missing some orchestra to go on a trip, I might have done that, but I was so low on the totem pole in the orchestra, it didn't make any difference. I think I might have tried to use once the I'm late with a paper because I went on a field hockey. So the whole notion again of performance and expectations, great question. It didn't have anything to do with my college experience.
That question really opens up a huge bag of worms that we don't have time to get into. But professors definitely knew you were athletes. They definitely communicated with the athletic department. There were certain athletes that were pushed towards certain classes because they came into this institution probably when they shouldn't have come into this institution because they weren't academically prepared to do so. We had great academic advisors and tutors, but even with that, a lot of students needed a lot more time to ramp up to be prepared for the rigors of college, myself included. There were just certain things that we weren't accustomed to, whereas someone that came from a more affluent area probably had more resources before they got here, and they were probably accustomed to taking certain classes, taking notes, homework. So that was a long way of saying, yes, professors knew we were athletes. As much as we tried to sit up front, well, a lot of guys sat in the back. But I tried to sit in the front. Even though we tried to do those things, we showed that we wanted to learn, that we wanted to be there. Some still treated you as if you were an athlete, and they really didn't care for you because no matter what they did, you were going to pass. Whereas some professors were a little bit more stubborn, a little bit more, you're not going to change my ways. You're a student first, and they're going to treat you as a student regardless of your sport or not. But yeah, that's a big question with a lot more involved.
I just have two questions here real quick. Dr. Patterson, I was a student athlete myself, and I kind of struggled with that identity, wanting to be something other than an athlete when I got off the field. What are some of the steps you took to separate and establish yourself in other platforms? And then for Miss Beth, did you try and establish yourself more as that identity as an athlete because of the situation that you were in, and you just were fortunate to do it, and did you take steps to ensure that you were known as that?
Well, I tripped and failed a whole bunch of times before I really started to get it right. I spoke about this with Michaela. Where's Michaela? We spoke about this just the other day because, athletes, we're in these bubbles on campus, and it's like we're in a fishbowl. When you're on campus, you're doing all these things, you're praised, everyone knows your name, and then, for me, you go home. And it's an identity crisis because you didn't go pro. You don't have this nice car, nice house. You don't have all these great things that you're expected to have because, that's what people do. You go to college, you go pro. And when that doesn't happen, now you have a lot of college athletes that are depressed because you're not the man, you're not the woman, you're not the person anymore. So it really came down to having mentors that had been there, done that, and knew how to navigate those murky waters. Because it's scary when you get done and you're not playing ball anymore. You're not catching balls. You're not running over hurdles. You don't know what to do with yourself. Because who are you now? You're not an athlete. You're not a student. So who the heck are you? So that's one thing that I definitely struggle with. But mentors helped. Having friends that looked at me as more than just an athlete. Also, finding a passion. Dino Bell again, helping me find different jobs. But really just falling on my face a number of times and then realizing those are just opportunities to learn and moving past them.
Again, I never had to struggle with identity in sport and the rest of my life. And I knew I was never going to go pro. I think that's a huge issue, and we see that in terms of student first. We were talking about the wonderful NCAA ads on the percentage of kids that go pro. It was just one more thing I got to do. So I was in the orchestra. I got to be in a sorority. I got to get a degree. For me, it was always more around the job, that you were going to have a job by the time you graduated. So the whole dynamic that being a Division I athlete that's there and so real today, along with all the rest of the layers, it just wasn't a part of identity complexity for me. It was about having a job so I could go on spring break my senior year knowing I had that box checked and could have a great time. And oh, by the way, I did. So it was much more oriented to always career than it was sport. So that makes me not in the same position that lots of our student athletes today are.
And one more thing, Shannon, I'd say to answer another thing, K-Club. If you're an athlete, especially if you're an athlete here or any other institution, you're a letter association. But K-Club, we're definitely here to help point you in the right direction and help in any way we can.
Also didn't have a K-Club.
Yeah. Again, I think it's a great institution that we have here, connected with the athletic department. I'll just add, that's the myth that we have with sports, especially male-dominated sports, with that you go pro. And the percentage of going pro is extremely small. What we always try to talk to the student athletes about is that you're at a Division I institution where you've got about 80 to 100 players on your team, and how many Division I institutions are there, and then you go down to in the 30s of professional teams with 32, 35 players on a team.
I think it's like 2.5% for the NFL, 2.5 for CFL, 1.5 for Arena.
Exactly. Yeah, it's below 2 for most things, or around 2 for everything. So your percentage drops, and they don't. They're really not taught that. They're put on this, very much as you said, Eric. Your life, you were tracked that you were an athlete. You were an athlete. You were an athlete through grade school, junior high, high school, and into college. And what that means, especially for a football player, is that you're going pro. and we don't help students enough that that's not going to be the reality. So, for most of us. So.
Hi, Beth. I actually have a question for you. It's along the lines of gender. You discussed that. So you had some daily things that were just different, very different than the modern female student athlete, like the gender Jayhawk. I had never even thought about that. Like that's so I think that's a really cool thing to think about. Did you have any like direct opposition, like your participation? Like, did you have any instances where you really felt like people made it clear to you that they didn't agree with the fact that you were given the opportunity or that you should be there, or was it mostly just kind of the things that you didn't expect because of that idea that you should be just happy to be able to participate, which still actually exists today?
Yeah, I that's not so much, but my dad was a coach, so I'm a coach's kid, and so we were always around sport, and my mother kept thinking I'd grow out of these sports. Right, so you're still going to do this field hockey thing? Really, you want to run a marathon? So, but she was a cheerleader, you know. So I really, even in my own family, sport was kind of part of the narrative. And I don't remember anybody ever pushing back on you can't do that or you don't want to do that. It was more people working to, you couldn't be in two places at one time, and if I asked to try to figure that out, and I'll still do the work, that I didn't run into people saying no. I didn't experience that at home. I don't remember any of that kind of pushback. It truly was more, there were folks even after I graduated that were trying to make sure when we got into an era, we had lots of different women's sports, and now we're not going to have as many. And we're going to start cutting back in terms of financial principles on putting more into maybe fewer. I had graduated. So that might have been more where there was even more tension around what do we support, how do we use our money. I mean, that would kind of be a whole nother conversation because women's sports went through some of that also in the 80s, maybe in some ways that men's did. How do you stretch those dollars? But I personally never ran into that in my family.
So, Dr. Patterson, football is often described, and a lot of team sports in general, as something that requires a lot of trust between teammates to sort of work. And so I was wondering, with that segregated locker room environment and everything, how did that play out on the field, and did it have any sort of effect in that sense?
Most times on the field, it wasn't present, which was weird. Occasionally you would see someone miss a block on purpose or drop a ball on purpose or miss a throw on purpose. But that typically wasn't related to race. That was just petty stuff, guys being guys. But on game day, we were supportive of each other. If it came to a fight with a group of individuals and the football team, whether it be black or white or whoever, the football team was going to support the football team no matter what. But so the segregation was amongst ourselves. We saved it for ourselves, and it wasn't for the outside world. It was strange in that regard for me, but that's what it was.
Hey. Okay. Question for you both. What advice would you offer to faculty and staff that are helping or that are involved in the development of the student athlete and the different identities that they are having to try to navigate? What advice do you offer for those that look like them, those that don't look like them, that interact with them daily, that don't interact with them as much? Just what advice to kind of, and you both can speak on it differently, but to help them navigate those different identities.
Let me go first and just be quick because I don't work with Eric has so much wisdom in that he's in so many places that I'm not. But I think the issue of identity, I love your question, and I love the issue of understanding each person and helping them, whether it's coaches or students. I've had the benefit of helping students with mock interviewing, but really understanding each person, each student, and the identities and the demands they struggle with, trying to know more of their story, and then give them the same kind of advice or wisdom you give to anybody that's your view of real world and how that plays out, and just name your own lens and your own bias or experience as you share that with them so that they can sort that through for themselves. And again, I say that as a non-teacher, non-parent who's just really impressed with our kids and the kind of conversations they have and how they present themselves and and what they can siphon through. And man, they are so much more worldly than I ever was. So be honest, claim your own, be sensitive to the identities and all the different layers, and then name your own where you're coming from in the advice or the counseling you give them. That would just be what I've learned over time.
I don't really have very much to add to that. I mean, yeah, owning your truth, I like that piece, but recognizing that your perspective is your own and that you don't have to, but I think that they should try to offer different perspectives by introducing people. So not letting them be comfortable in their own skin. Candace does it all the time to me, pushing me to do things that I normally wouldn't do. I think that's what mentors, advisors, faculty members need to do. I think they need to be consistent in that not treating a student athlete differently than they would treat a normal student. I think if they feel that they need to offer some type of special assistance or offer some type of special treatment, they need to be factual, truthful, and upfront in why they're doing that, so that it doesn't come back to them, to that student athlete, months, days later, where they feel like they're going backwards, like they're being babied, like they're being coddled. Because a lot of people think that athletes are coddled enough anyways. So we need to help push them out into the world and help them realize and see real life situations. And I think the earlier that they own it, the better that they're gonna be.
So Dr. Patterson, I have a question. You can correct me if I misunderstood you. It sounds like to me that your experience at KU, that you were frustrated, that it was a lonely experience, that kind of made you angry at times. What were kind of your, were there places that you could go that kind of were spaces that you could own, where you could get away from those frustrations of the football team? I mean, I can't imagine that the general student body at KU was that diverse. Certainly Lawrence wasn't very diverse. I mean, where does one who's finding so much frustration in the space that you love so much with sports go to find a better place?
That's a great question, and I don't mean to come off like I was always frustrated. I mean, I was a young boy trying to become a man.
From California.
From California. And I was experiencing all kinds of emotions. So I had happy days, bad days, sad days, great days, days I didn't want to go to class, days I wanted to party. And so I think a lot of students experience those different identities and those highs and those lows. For me, those different identities that were race focused and that were focused around sport, those things were hard for me. But I think finding things such as my fraternity, Phi Beta Sigma fraternity, was an outlet for me. The track team was an outlet for me. Finding students that enjoyed things outside of KU, going fishing, was a joy for me. So just finding those things that I could just be me, what I perceive to be me, away from football, away from track, away from homework, just the ability to escape. And my fraternity definitely was one of those, and just things outside of school. Hopefully that answered your question.
Well, very good. I think we touched on every topic, right? We touched about the differences, really. We didn't say economic, but there's differences with the economics, right? And definitely the difference between how economics have changed sports, right? We've talked about that numerous times over these events, But Beth made a very good, interesting comment where she said, we had a uniform, but the shoes were ours, et cetera, right? We jumped to the 80s, right? For women's basketball, we talked about how in another one of these events where the women's team was given one pair of shoes, right? So this transformation and change. We talked about race, we talked about gender, we talked about Title IX. So we touched on everything, and I'd like to thank you for participating. And what we're going to do now is always that weird transition. So don't leave. But we're going to come off the stage, and we're going to welcome Deasia Page up on the stage, who's going to introduce our keynote speaker. But thank you very much.
I've never been an athlete, unlike some of the people you've heard from today, but I am a sports fan. And it's often difficult being a female sports fan in a very male-dominated realm that often isn't inclusive of women's issues. However, reading pieces written by today's keynote speaker, like the one in which we reminded everyone that the WNBA has been at the forefront of anthem protests, even before Kapernick took the kneel, has made it easier for me being a female sports fan. Okay. Kavitha Davidson is a sports writer and columnist whose work has been featured in ESPN and Bloomberg, where she primarily wrote about the intersections of sports, race, culture, gender, and business. She's also a native New Yorker, and she attended Columbia University, where she was a sports editor for the school's newspaper. She's currently writing a book with the University of Texas Press about sports fandom. So without much further ado, everyone please join me in welcoming tonight's keynote speaker, Kavitha Davidson.
Hello. Thank you so much, Deja, for that very generous introduction. I can't even begin to express how excited and honored I am to be here. Thank you to the University of Kansas, to the Langston Hughes Center, to Professor Alexander, the KU School of Business, and everyone who's been so welcoming. This is my first time in Kansas, and I've had a great 2 days so far. I wish I had more time here. But I did call my mother this morning and say, we have to come back. You would love Kansas, and especially the barbecue. That's not a joke, I promise. Considering the titans of the industry that you've had in this position before, Dave Zirin, who's a good friend of mine, Dr. Edwards, the two living legends, Bill Rhoden and Claire Smith, who I consider icons and complete role models in what I do, you're probably thinking to yourself, seriously, who is this chick, right? And that's fair. I would have the same thought. I'm not gonna lie, the prospect of standing here in this place previously occupied by those names has been awesome to think about, but also really daunting. And it's an incredible privilege, most of all, and I hope I'll do my best to do it justice. So seriously, who is this chick? As you can imagine, I get asked this all the time. How did you get into sports writing? And it's a question I get asked as a woman. It's a question I get asked as a brown woman. And as you can imagine, I've answered that question in probably more words than are necessary, time and again. If you'll indulge me for a minute, I'll talk about my personal history in a little bit with that. Mostly because to me, sports are so personal and intimately connected to who I am. I'm a comic book nerd, DC, but Marvel's fine. And I like to call it my origin story. And like most origin stories, this one starts with my parents. For background, my mom's a scientist. My dad works in criminal justice reform, so my politics probably shouldn't be any surprise to anybody. My parents immigrated to America from India in 1981. I'm the only member of my family who was born in this country, so my mom could pursue her postdoctoral fellowship. American sports really weren't in their purview, but upon landing in New York, my parents, and particularly my mom, got really into boxing in 1981. If you've ever met my mom, you would ask the question that I did: how did this happen? She's this 5'0". She'll tell you she's 5'1". She's absolutely not. Indian woman scientist who actually averts her eyes anytime a fight scene or violence comes on the TV. Yet she fell in love with combat sports in the early 80s. I naturally had some questions. She told me that her uncle back in India had been a boxer, and he was a huge fan of Muhammad Ali's. When Ali, who was at the time still known as Cassius Clay, beat Sonny Liston in 1964, she remembers her uncle running into the house the next day with the newspaper with the headline, the newspaper being the only way that people in India at the time could follow Ali's fights. Together, they listened to a song that I didn't know existed, but she still remembers the lyrics of from the 70s, called Black Superman. If any of our older members of the audience remember this song. If not, it's on Spotify, guys. But the lyrics include float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, and they would sing it together. This song, in 1980, it depicts Ali's defeat of George Foreman in the Rumble in the Jungle. This song was played throughout the streets of Chennai, which is a city in South India, which is where both of my parents are from, in 1980, when Ali actually visited India. He visited 4 cities, and Chennai was the last of them, to fight an exhibition fight against another great American boxer, Jimmy Ellis. It was a 4-city tour that he did that was part of his campaign to convince other countries to join the US's boycott of the 1980 Olympics in Moscow. Thousands of people showed up to the airport in Meenambakkam and filled Nehru Stadium to watch Ali, to watch him fight Ellis. As part of the program, he also fought local boxers, which, if you've ever seen any photos of a high school team trying to play a college team, it's not just the height difference, it's a weight difference. Nobody really had any chance there. But one of those local Indian boxers was a 21-year-old named Rocky Brass. That was his stage name. His real name was Rochester Cloves, and I can't figure out which one actually should have been the stage name. Everything about that's amazing. After their fight, which predictably didn't last too long, Ali spoke to local media, and he praised Rocky in a few words. He said he was a promising young boxer, which was a generous way to describe him, I think. But as a result of that interview, Rocky got a very low-level job working at a local railway. He started as a dock worker, and over the next 4 decades almost, worked his way up to be an express train guard, retiring in 2017 after 37 years with the same company. All that goes to show you how transcendent both Ali and the nature of sports are in general. That someone like Rocky could get a job based on a few words of appreciation from someone like Muhammad Ali and keep that job for 40 years is really incredible. That someone like my mother, who never had the opportunity to watch an Ali fight until she came to this country, still felt the social impact of this larger-than-life figure, a world-class athlete whose legacy extends far beyond the confines of a boxing ring, shows the power of sports to cross cultural and international borders while bridging the gaps in between. If boxing laid the foundation for my mom's sports fandom in America, basketball is what cemented it. In 1980s New York, Bernard was king before passing that mantle on to Patrick. And though the Knicks were struggling, what else is new? It's impossible to overstate how much basketball meant, and still means, despite it all, to the cultural fabric of New York. As my mother puts it, and I asked her about this recently, basketball was a way for her to relate to her new hometown, her new home country, and to forge an identity as a New Yorker, and by an extension as an American. It's a good thing she told me that story, because frankly, I would have held it against her for the rest of my life for making me a Knicks fan. It's been 20 years of long suffering at this point, and it's all your fault, Mom. My mom's is a story that resonates with me and with many others for whom sports have helped shape their identity and our place in American society. Basketball was my first love. I remember the heartbreak of that '94 finals, watching Hakeem go at it with Patrick with the split screen of an OJ Chase next to it, if anybody remembers that incredible day. June 4th, 1990, June 7th, 1994. But while I have my mom to blame for my Knicks fandom, it was pretty much impossible to be a kid growing up in New York in the mid to late 90s and not get sucked into local sports. We were very good at them at the time. My parents, my family, we didn't have a lot of money growing up, and the idea of going to a game at the Garden, going to watch sports live seemed like this luxury that you had to be kind of special to actually experience. We never really considered it. So it wasn't until a school trip that I got to experience the joy of live sports. It was a trip that forever changed my life. Baseball had always been somewhere in the back of my mind. I'm from a neighborhood in northern Manhattan called Washington Heights. It's a poor, very heavily Dominican neighborhood where Manny Ramirez is from. He is the prodigal son of the Heights. And you can still see kids playing baseball on the street. It's one of the few places in New York, especially Manhattan, that still feels like a neighborhood. It's also walking distance from Yankee Stadium. It's walking distance from where the old Polo Grounds was. And it was home to Hilltop Park, which was the Yankees' first stadium after they moved from Baltimore before they became the Yankees and were known as the Highlanders. So all the makings, culturally and spatially, of baseball fandom were there for me. But, you know, my parents are from India, so all they knew was cricket, which I'm sure is a great sport. I still don't understand it. If someone would love to explain that to me, I'm here for that. But I kind of needed this push from the outside to get straight to the diamond. So enter my school, specifically our principal, who was a rabid Yankees fan, and planned this class trip. And Virginia Connor, you're somewhere out there, you created a monster. It was the home opener at Yankee Stadium in 1996 against your Kansas City Royals. I remember that day really vividly. It was snowing. It was Andy Pettitte started. It was Andy Pettitte bobblehead day, actually. And I still have that bobblehead, believe it or not. It's hanging on my bar in my apartment. All my classmates showed up in jerseys and caps, and they were talking to each other about these players and these stats, and it was a whole other language to me. I didn't really understand it. But from the moment we got to the stadium, something in the air was just magical. It was unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. Thousands of fans waiting at the gate to get in, a sea of pinstripes chanting, "Let's go Yankees." And then something not so magical happened, but something very New York. A pigeon pooped on me. I hadn't noticed at the time. I was waiting to get in. I was also surrounded by thousands of people and probably a little bit of sensory overload. But a classmate behind me was, in not so artful language, informed me that this happened. And I didn't believe him. I thought he was teasing me. You know, I was the outsider at a baseball game. And then he took the hood from my hoodie and swung it around. And the look of horror on my face, so that happened. Everyone else, of course, was over the moon because that's supposed to be good luck. And they were literally saying, "This means we're going to win the game today, right?" We did actually win that game, 7-3. And once I got over the earlier trauma and found a trash bin for my sweatshirt, it hit me, the magic of baseball. The smells, the sights, the sounds. Old Yankee Stadium had this sound that new Yankee Stadium does not have. And you could feel it in the pit of your stomach. It was a physical, visceral sound. It all added up to that feeling. And I still get that feeling every time I walk into certain ballparks. I hate to say it, Fenway is one of them. Wrigley is definitely another one of them. I haven't been to the stadium here, but as I said, I'm planning to come back, and I would love to do that. But looking back on it, it was the sheer spectacle of it all. It was the communal, almost tribal nature of being a part of this thing. That here on this snowy afternoon in the South Bronx, you were surrounded by 57,000 people of all races, ages, genders, different languages, people in jerseys, people in suits, all rooting for this one singular thing. And it was so utterly, beautifully American to me. I won't bore you with the rest of my history as a sports fan. The rest of the 90s were pretty good to me as a Yankees fan, right? By the time I got to high school, 2002, I knew I wanted to be a sports writer. But honestly, it was a graduate level class in college that I had to petition to take, and I have to take a moment to commend Professor Alexander, because if I had classes like these readily available to me in college, I would have taken them by the handful, and it would have even further set me down this path. But this class, it was called the Socio-Historical Foundations of American Sport. And it provided me with an academic background to better view this thing that I thought was just sports. You know, I like to go to games and eat popcorn and watch my team win more often than not. And instead, it gave me this foundation to view sports as a vehicle to examine broader topics: history, economics, urban planning. I was an urban planning major. That clearly worked out. Sociology, gender, of course, race too. We studied things how, at the turn of the century, Italian and Irish immigrants, the ethnic whites, used baseball to assimilate into American society, how those avenues were obviously closed off to Black Americans, the parallels between the American labor movement and the rise of sports unions, and the fact that probably the strongest union that still exists in this country is the Major League Baseball Players Association. We'll see how that goes when there's a lockout in a couple of years. The role that athletes like Ali, Jackie, Althea Gibson, Tommy Smith, John Carlos played in furthering civil rights, the rise of Title IX and calls for equal opportunities for women athletes alongside the rise of second-wave feminism, the increased practice of stadium subsidies, which still happens, obviously, and local political sweetheart deals as a new form of corporate welfare. It was with all of this as context that I've tried to cover sports with an eye toward the bigger picture. And I like to say that you don't have to be a sports fan to care about sports, to care about the kinds of things that I'd like to cover, or at least to feel their impact in some way. If you're a taxpayer, sports affects you. If you're a woman fighting for equal pay in your industry, you might be interested to see how those arguments are being made by athletes like Venus Williams and Megan Rapinoe. If you're a Black parent trying to explain to your son why he can't walk down the street in a hoodie, Colin Kapernick is bound to come up in that conversation. It's precisely this history and these dynamics that belie the notion that sports has ever not been political, that the phenomenon of athletes using their platforms to elevate social causes is somehow something new. Perhaps some players and fans have always been able to just stick to sports, to experience and enjoy sports as purely an escape from a troubling world beyond, and that's perfectly fine. But the reality for many of us, and I suspect many in the room today, is that sports has, as much as we love them, sports hasn't always been a place that has included us. And that in that way is still a perfect reflection of that world beyond from which we can't actually escape. So the realities of athletes using sports to further social justice hasn't changed from decades past. What has changed is their methods and their reach. This in itself is the double-edged sword of Colin Kaepernick's movement, and I promised myself I wasn't going to talk about Kaepernick as much not because he's not incredibly important, but because I think, what more can we add to this conversation? And then he signed the settlement, and then it would just seem ridiculous to ignore what's actually going on right now and the conversations that people are having. Kaepernick started out doing a quiet gesture, a quiet individual gesture, before preseason games that frankly, nobody noticed. Remember, he initially sat for 2 games, and nobody paid him any attention. There was no media coverage, nobody else joined in, there was no hashtag Stand With Cap, no backlash alongside it, until the 3rd preseason game. But what started as this silent, individual gesture against police brutality and the realities of being Black in America ballooned into a sports-wide movement and a national conversation about the nature of protest and patriotism. But patriotism is a funny thing. It means so many things to so many different people, just like what it means to be an American. There's no singular correct definition of this, but at this particular moment in our history, some have taken it upon themselves to question other people's Americanness, including people like Kapernick, who remind us that each of our American experience is different based on where we were born, how we were raised, and what we look like. But protest has always been patriotic. The spirit of protest is fundamental to our country's founding, and the freedom to do so peacefully is a core tenet of our ideology. Questioning America's greatness does not mean we love her any less. It means we love her so much, her promise and her potential, that we want her to live up to both. The same thing can be said about sports. A frequent comment I get when I write about problems in sports, particularly football, but all sports, is, wow, you must really hate football, right? Or you secretly hate sports, don't you? I promise you I'm not some ninja, underage agent that has, I haven't dedicated my career to covering something that I hate. I promise you that that's not the case. But it's our job as journalists to keep our institutions in check and to force them to do better. That applies as much to covering sports as it does to covering the White House. But I also believe it's my duty as a fan. It's not necessarily anybody else's duty as a fan. I personally believe it's my duty as a fan to treat sports in the same critical way that I do the country, that I love sports so much that I want them to be better. Going back to Kaepernick, suddenly people started noticing what he was doing, and we talked for a hot second about the actual issues that he wanted to cover, but it didn't really take long for the conversation around systemic racism to shift to people calling him anti-police, anti-military, anti-football, all of which were really to say he was anti-American. This isn't anything new when it comes to denigrating civil rights leaders and obscuring their message. A week before he was killed, a Harris poll showed that 75% of Americans disapproved of Dr. King. And by that point, he had evolved from a much more incremental approach to societal change to a revolutionary reimagining of what American society could be for Black and whites. White Americans responded with a refrain now familiar, that he was trying to divide and not unite us. Well, we've historically seen this in sports as well. My former colleague, the great Howard Bryant, has written a book called The Heritage about the history of athlete protests among Black American athletes, the tradition of social protest, and he tells the story of Paul Robeson, musician and actor who was first known as a first-team All-American football player and would be a leading voice in civil rights activism. He was an early advocate for the integration of baseball. He called for boycotts of Yankee Stadium and the Polo Grounds. And in 1949, the very beginning of the Civil War, Robeson gave a speech in France during the Paris Peace Accords, denouncing the conflict between the US and the Soviet Union. His point was simply that another world war, so soon after the second, was entirely avoidable, and that many Americans were actually against it. But before he spoke, his speech was misquoted and transcribed and distributed to American media outlets. By the time American media outlets published what was not his actual speech, politicians had branded him as un-American, inaccurately saying that he implied Black Americans would refuse to fight in a war against the Soviets, which also falls perfectly in line with the history of this country denying Black Americans their military service. They called him names like Black Stalin and Voice of the Kremlin. He was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee, where they convinced a very reluctant Jackie Robinson to publicly denounce Robeson's comments as not representing all Black Americans. But in the same testimony, and this doesn't ever get covered unless you dig a little bit deeper, Jackie also said, "The fact that because it is a communist who denounces injustice in the courts, police brutality, and lynching when it happens, doesn't change the truth of his charges." The strategy on the other side here was to position Robeson as this radical anti-American communist against the more subdued and frankly white-friendly Robinson. He integrated baseball, so racism was clearly over, right? Of course, we now know that that was a very sanitized version of Jackie's activism and beliefs, a story spun and sold to make the idea of integration more palatable to white Americans at the time. But in his 1972 autobiography, I Never Had It Made, Jackie wrote about how difficult those years actually were for him, how he still felt like an outsider in his own game and his own country. Describing his first World Series game, he wrote, "There I was, the black grandson of a slave, the son of a black sharecropper, part of a historic occasion, a symbolic hero to my people. The air was sparkling, the sunlight was warm, the band struck up the national anthem, and the flag billowed in the wind. It should have been a glorious moment for me as the stirring words of the national anthem poured from the stands. Perhaps it was, but then again, perhaps the anthem should be called the theme song for a drama called The Noble Experiment. Today, I look back on that opening game of my first World Series. I must tell you that it was Mr. Ricky's drama and that I was only a principal actor. As I write this 20 years later, I cannot stand and sing the anthem. I cannot salute the flag. I know that I am a black man in a white world. In 1972, in 1947, at my birth in 1919, I know that I never had it made." That's Jackie Robinson, baseball legend, military veteran, American hero. And we would never dare to call him anti-American, right? Fast forward to today, and that's exactly what we continue to see. Athletes refusing to stay in their lane and having their citizenry questioned because of it. If you don't like it, don't play, is the new, if you don't like it, leave the country. Whether it's Kapernick, LeBron, Serena, Eric Reed, Malcolm Jenkins, the Bennett brothers, the Minnesota Lynx, the entire WNBA. Here I'm going to take a moment to acknowledge, and Deja set this up very well for me, those activists who never actually get proper credit for being at the forefront of civil rights movements, Black women. Before there was anthem kneeling, there were Black Lives Matters and I Can't Breathe t-shirts. WNBA teams like the Lynx, Los Angeles Sparks, the Indiana Fever were the first in any league to organize team-wide demonstrations. This was long before the president called out the NFL, long before NFL owners like Jerry Jones decided it might be a good PR move to start kneeling with their players. Similarly, Serena Williams has been speaking out against police brutality as far back as 2015. She raised her fist in pride when she won Wimbledon to tie Steffi Graf for the all-time major wins record, mirroring Tommy Smith and John Carlos. When she's written or talked about these issues more recently, she's been accused of trying to capitalize on Kaepernick's movement. The contributions of Black women have long been ignored in the activist space, whether it's civil rights, women's rights, gay rights, trans rights, so let's not ignore them anymore. So I promised myself I wouldn't spend this whole time talking about Colin Kaepernick, but in thinking about this event and about Cap, and about my own personal relationship to sports, I kept coming back to this question of what it means to be an American, and of what role sports may play in that. Many of the things we talk about in sports today are incredibly divisive. Nobody seems to have a moderate opinion on athlete protests, or how much money players deserve to make, or whether we should pay college athletes. But I also truly believe in the power of sports to unite us. Though we come from different places and root for different teams, though we disagree on how sports should work and the society they should reflect, we all still fall under the common identity of sports fan. The varying ways we experience and express our fandom has always fascinated me. Growing up in New York City and going to the schools that I did, I never truly understood the high school or college sports scene. Look, my high school was named after Peter Stuyvesant, and our football team is called the Peg Legs, actually. If you've ever seen Spider-Man Homecoming, the science school that he went to is modeled after one of the schools that I went to, and it's a really accurate representation. Our trophy case was full of math team and robotics club and speech and debate trophies, and not a single athletic trophy. And then I went to Columbia, and listen, there's not a lot of tailgating for crew and fencing, so it's a completely different cultural experience as a sports fan. The most successful athletes to come out of my college were Marcellus Wiley and Lou Gehrig. It's been a while. So it's really been great for me to have the opportunity to travel to schools like KU for my job, to experience the purity and excitement of college ball through all of your eyes. Every campus has a different sports culture, and no one is more valid than the other. That differing experience of sports fandom is something that I'm exploring in a book I'm writing with a good friend of mine, Jessica Luther. She's a freelance journalist who first broke the Baylor story 4 years ago. And basically, we're exploring the various moral dilemmas of sports fandom and how different fans deal with them. You know, like I said, some fans are able to just completely put those issues out of their mind, and there's nothing wrong with that. And there are many other mechanisms that we use to navigate some of those murkier waters. We're covering everything from domestic violence on one of the players on your team, to watching NASCAR when there are Confederate flags still flying in the stands, to more fun topics like how to love your team when you hate your owner. And again, I'm a Knicks fan. What we found so far is there isn't one method here. But those of us who can't shut off our brains, as some can, I wanted to see how we manage to stay fans, and it's definitely difficult. A lot of fans I've talked to said that they actually haven't. Plenty of black fans that I know have stopped watching NFL games because of the league's treatment of Kapernick. I talked to one fan of the Washington football game who refuses to watch his team and give any more money to Dan Snyder until the name and the logo changes. But still, for many of us, we look at sports and say, I just can't quit you. Ooh, I'm missing 2 pages from the back here, sorry. If you'll give me a moment. Nope, all right. I remember what I said there. For many of us, we look at sports and say, I just can't quit you. We justify this in a lot of ways, and I won't go through them all. Buy the book, please. But the one thing that every fan I've talked to has said is basically, I can't quit my team because it's a part of me. It's a part of my hometown, and it's a part of my identity. And that, to me, is the most American thing of all. If we have 50 states of sports fandom, we're still united by a single game. And of course, sports as a unifier isn't a uniquely American thing. The impact of Muhammad Ali stretching all the way to my mother in India shows that. My favorite example of this is Nelson Mandela and the South African national rugby team. Do you guys know this story? So the South African national rugby team, called the Springboks, in 1995, the year after apartheid ended, and Mandela was elected president, South Africa was in utter turmoil. The threat of terrorism from far whites who resented their first black president was very real. The country was still very fractured between those whites who had lost their singular grip on power and the black majority that had suffered so much at their hands. Mandela made it his mission to somehow build a new South Africa on a foundation of racial unity and trust. He saw an opportunity in the upcoming Rugby World Cup hosted by South Africa. Rugby had been one of many sports to boycott the country under apartheid, and South Africa had been excluded from the previous 2 World Cups. He invited the captain of the Springboks, a white, blonde Afrikaner, a son of apartheid, to his house for tea, and convinced him to join the effort to unite the country. Mandela faced an equal challenge in convincing his black supporters, who actually booed him when he first spoke about supporting the team. Can you imagine booing Mandela in South Africa? But they saw rugby in the Springboks jersey as a symbol of apartheid, with segregated stadiums and teams. Despite this history of exclusion, Mandela wanted to spread the message that the Springboks belong to all of us now. The team took up the motto, one team, one country. The players, all of them white except for one, learned the lyrics to an old song of black resistance that was the country's new national anthem and sang it before each game at the World Cup. Black South Africans responded in kind and with an incredible capacity for forgiveness, cheering the Springboks through each victory all the way to the World Cup final. Before that championship game, Mandela walked onto the pitch to greet the players wearing that green Springbok shirt that had for so long been a visual representation of oppression. There was a slight moment of silence. The audience didn't really know what to do with it. And then everyone started cheering and chanting his name in unison. 95% of the spectators were white, and somehow they were all united in this singular cause. Instead of let's go Yankees, the chant was Nelson. Now, South Africa went on to win that World Cup. It was 2 miracles that happened that day because they were playing the very heavily favored New Zealand national team. But that kind of just goes to show you what sports can do, the power that sports can have, and how not any one of our experiences of sports is any more valid than the other. It also goes to show you how from Muhammad to Jackie to Paul to Jesse, Serena, and now Kapernick, history has always avenged these figures. History has always been on their side. In 50 years, I very much believe that the athletes that are using their platforms right now will be viewed in a much more positive light than we're giving them now. So I want to end on another Mandela story, and this is a personal favorite of mine. In 1990, it was the year that Mandela had been freed from jail, 27 years that he spent in jail. And it was 4 years after the actual end of apartheid, 4 years after he was elected president. He did a 3-day tour of New York City that included a speech at Riverside Church, which is in Harlem. It's this historic, beautiful church that we have in the city, and a parade, a ticker tape parade down the Canyon of Heroes. The Canyon of Heroes has hosted over 200 parades over the years. They've, ranged from returning military veterans to celebrating, various sports championships. As a side note, in 2008, when the Giants beat the Patriots, I skipped class to go to that victory parade, and I regret nothing. The culmination of that 3-day tour was a visit to Yankee Stadium. He gave a resounding speech. He was greeted by a sold-out crowd, and he ended the speech thanking New Yorkers for being so open and welcoming to him. And that was the end of his written speech. And then Mayor David Dinkins, who was our last black mayor that we've had, put a Yankee cap on his head and the Yankee bomber jacket around his shoulders. And Mandiba just smiled and said, "Now you know who I am. I am a Yankee. So take that, Boston." Thank you. I think we're going to do questions. My first one is, what happened to my last 2 pages? I've told that Yankee Stadium story many times. Yeah. It's late. It's been a long couple of hours.
What can Colin Kaepernick do next? I feel like he started it, but there's still more to do. What next can he do?
So I think I appreciate the question. I think it's somewhat unfair to ask that of him because, like I said, he didn't go into this thinking he was going to launch a movement. And I think it's a little bit unfair to place the burden of the whole movement on one man's shoulders. I think what he's done so far is far and beyond what we could have asked of him. And still you have Kaepernick supporters, and I understand where they're coming from, wishing he hadn't taken the settlement, right? Because then we would have gotten to discovery with the NFL and we would have seen what he actually had on them. But he also sacrificed his career for 2 years. He sacrificed a paycheck for 2 years. I think what he can do next is what he's been doing for the last 2 years, which is silently donating money to all of the causes and maybe once in a while taking a speaking engagement, even though he's not particularly comfortable doing that in itself. I think he's done plenty, though.
Given the history of protest by athletes in this country, why do you think it is still so easy for people in general to objectify and vilify athletes when they do take a stand? Because as you alluded to, down the road, we'll recognize the contributions of these individuals somewhere along the line. Muhammad Ali was vilified, now he's a hero. So why do you think it's still so easy for us to vilify these individuals?
Mm-hmm. I tend to take the view that despite the promises of our country, we're still completely anti-labor. And especially the Black athlete force is an underappreciated labor force. Whenever you hear about contracts negotiations and things like that, fans tend to take ownership side, and they tend to say things like, this player wants too much money for playing this game. And they never actually walk around and consider how much money the people paying them are making off of that, right? So we've evolved from the 50s and 60s to this point now where athletes not only have more vocal power, they have more monetary power. And a lot of people resent that very much. And the idea is that they're getting paid to play a game, not that they're getting paid to provide a product that we're all very willing to spend our money on, but that they're getting paid to play a game. And it's this idea that they're not of a deserving class of people that make their money. I think that when people protest, the idea from the people who take it upon themselves that they're the ones being protested against, even if they're not, is, well, shouldn't you be happy with what you already have, with the strides that you've made, with where you are right now? And you can definitely see how much athletes have gained in the last few decades and maybe come to that conclusion if you're only comparing them against athletes of the past. But that's not where the fair comparison is. It's really hard to say if and when we'll actually get to the point where people will understand and appreciate protest in the way that we hope that they do. This tends to be used against blacks who protest, but it was also used against the student protest movement in the 1960s. And it's something that is very much ingrained in us as a country, that we have this radical tradition. We are a country built on this radical tradition, but culturally we like to adhere to this idea of conformity and the respect for authority that protest isn't actually meant to overturn, but to change. So I don't really know how we evolve beyond where we are, except to further understand that history and to further understand the dynamics. And frankly, to keep hearing from people of color who are in the police force and in law enforcement and in the military, who will tell us from their own dual experiences why these protests aren't anti-American. Because it's very easy for me to stand up here as someone who's neither an athlete nor a veteran and tell you that. And it's another thing entirely to hear that from someone who occupies both spaces.
Thank you. Do you think the other teams and sports, not just football only, gave him enough support?
That's a really complicated question, because even within the NFL, there's a players' coalition that signed off on not participating in protests in exchange for what they thought were concessions from the NFL. And then there's an entirely different sect of players like like the Bennett brothers, who thought that they sold out a little bit. I think other players, as genuine as they might have been, needed a push, needed to see that more support was coming out for Kaepernick before they actually started to participate en masse. That obviously it doesn't apply to all players. Teams, though, I'm very cynical when it comes to this. I don't think teams or leagues do anything unless there's a PR motive. And, Bomani Jones wrote a great piece for The Undefeated about Kaepernick, and he basically said, the greatest thing Kaepernick brought us was bringing Jerry Jones to one knee. And listen, Jerry doesn't take that knee without proper motivation, right? So no, I don't really think that teams, if they did support their players, were genuinely into it. There are a couple of exceptions. There are a handful of owners that have bona fides in social justice and activism. But for the most part, it's all a business decision.
So in Kurt Flood's era, in his issue, he lamented the fact that the Pete Roses and the Willie Mays didn't come to his defense. So perhaps in comparison, years later, if a Tom Brady comes to his defense, maybe we see some movement.
Yeah, I think the only player that I can think of, Aaron Rodgers has said a little bit, but he is really good at obfuscating. Chris Long has been the only white player that I can think of that's actually been, Chris Kluwe, who's not in the league anymore, but Chris Long is the only active player, white player, that I can think of that's actually shown a proper level of solidarity here. Kurt Flood, it's funny, I wrote my my thesis paper in that graduate class on Curt Flood and free agency. And the tragedy there, and hopefully this won't be the tragedy with Kapernick or with his fellow athletes who have shown activism, is that Curt Flood never got to reap the benefits of free agency. And now, look, we're arguing, rightfully so, over labor dynamics in baseball after a $300 million contract was signed. But that is all part of this legacy that he didn't actually get to see personally fulfilled. So.
Just a real quick comment on that as well, Kavitha, following off of Peter and Ray's comments. We praise some of these coaches, some of these owners who have shown some consciousness. And my favorite one is we always like to look at Steve Kerr today and praise him, but we forget that he spoke out against Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf and his stance when he was a player. And that's been completely wiped from the history. And we now hold Kerr up as this great political activist standing with Kaepernick and other issues, but we forget, 20 years ago in these similar issues, he stood against a player.
Right.
In that history. So.
And that's absolutely we all need to keep the receipts on a lot of these people that we're praising right now. I love Popovich. Popovich also has a long history of backing up his activism in his actual basketball practices. He was the first NBA coach to properly mine immigrants, to properly mine European and Asian leagues for players, and to bring in translators and things like that to make that transition easier. With Steve Kerr, I went back and I watched Claire Smith's talk from last year, and she spoke about the 90s as kind of this lost generation of activism, right? And it's because, and we can't blame everything on Michael Jordan, but it's because of the influx of money and because there was a lot more to be made from keeping relatively silent. The famous quote, which Jordan actually didn't say, this is completely misattributed, but the famous quote is, "Republicans buy sneakers too." Somebody said it, it wasn't Michael. But that was very much the mentality then. So Steve Kerr falling completely in line there was a lot more to be gained. And listen, we're all in some ways a brand, right? If it's good for, his team is in San Francisco, and if it's good for his players to have solidarity, then he's going to do it. I don't doubt whatsoever that he believes in what he says. But it's always good to maintain that cynical eye and just go back and check the history.
So continuing to talk about the fight for labor equality, what do you think are some of the unique challenges facing collegiate athletes in the struggle for labor equality?
So this is a really fraught issue, right? And if anyone watched the game last night, Zion has brought this straight to the forefront. I think if you follow me on Twitter, you know exactly where I stand on this. I think athletes deserve compensation in some way. I don't quite know what the proper mechanism is there. There are a lot of voting bodies to be appeased in that. Power 5 conferences have already figured out a way to do that for their football players. But we need to start at least having this conversation. And the NCAA needs to start being more open to having that conversation. Hopefully the rise of the G League will create some of that pressure. Hopefully, it really is a mild sprain that Zion's going through, and we don't have to hold him up as this martyr, because I don't believe in martyrs to get causes passed. But I do think that there is a space here to properly have that conversation. Now, there's also a cultural dynamic that we have to overcome. If you poll people about support for paying college athletes, the yes and the no divides very starkly between white and black respondents. And that goes back to what we were talking about having an unpaid and underappreciated labor force. I don't have I'm not an economist. I don't have the answers quite for the mechanism there. There is an economist named Andy Schwartz, who is starting a league called the HBL, the Historic Basketball League, where he is paying players from HBCUs to play in a shortened season that doesn't coincide with the NCAA's season, and just trying it out as a model. I think more than anything, he's hoping that this will force the NCAA to come to the table in some of these conversations.
So something that's really frustrated me recently with the NFL is that along with this objection to, social justice protests, there is this overwhelming acceptance of players such as Kareem Hunt, who have a history of violence against women. As a woman in the sports world, how do you navigate that?
That was probably the first challenge that I encountered in my career. I started professionally sports writing for Bloomberg in December of 2013, and in mid to late 2014, the Ray Rice video hit, right? And I've covered more of these cases than I would like to have. I think with the case of Kareem Hunt, it's really difficult to have these conversations because of what I talked about earlier, because so many fans don't want to look at the video. There doesn't always have to be video. I'd also like to say that, by the way. But they also, they want to be able to just watch the players. They want to just be able to watch these games without thinking about these things. And one of the chapters of the book that I'm working on is precisely how do you root for your team when there's a player accused of doing something awful on it. It's always about how much that player can still bring, how much value that player can still bring. I think we saw that with Greg Hardy going to the Cowboys. And the interesting thing to me about Greg Hardy is not only did we have photos and we had a guilty conviction for the first trial, and then because of the appeals process, she didn't show up. I'm not going to get into that. But a team like the Cowboys took a chance on him, gave him performance incentives, all of that. And what ended up happening was his nature came out. He fought with players and coaches on the sidelines. He fought with people in practice. He was not a good teammate. And you probably could have guessed that based on his previous behavior. That's not to say I don't believe in second chances. I think one of the I think one of the sad parts about the Ray Rice thing is that he is probably the only athlete who has been through something like this, who, in my opinion, has shown true remorse. He's gone to anger management classes. He's really worked with domestic violence groups, and he gives talks to players now about that. And if you hear him talk about it, you can hear how much he has actually changed, and that it may have actually been a one-time thing. It's not for me to say that. But if he had been not at the tail end of his career, he absolutely at this point would have gotten another chance, right? It's hard for me to navigate those spaces. I'm a sexual assault survivor, and it's always hard for me to cover these kinds of things. But one woman that I interviewed for the book said to me that, Aroldis Chapman, closer now for the Yankees, was traded from the Reds to the Yankees 2 years ago for absolutely nothing because they wanted to get rid of him. He shot a gun at his girlfriend in the garage and all kinds. She was hiding in the bushes. There was a lot of things there. The Yankees ended up trading him to the Cubs, and the Cubs won the World Series with him as their closer. We signed him back, and I've written about how difficult that is for me because my favorite player of all time was our closer in the 90s, Mariano Rivera, and I've completely lost my ninth innings now. But the woman that I interviewed is a Cubs fan, and obviously, the Cubs were in the World Series, and you can't not root for your team, and they ended up winning, and how do you, there are all of these competing thoughts that you're having about this. And she said, I wasn't gonna stop rooting for my team. I don't stand when he comes into pitch. That's my little form of protest that I can justify to myself. But she also started a Twitter campaign where I believe it was for every strikeout, not every out. For every strikeout Chapman recorded, she donated $1 to her local domestic violence shelter. And that was her really small way of offsetting the impact that he had with something that was localized and that she thought was taking actual action. And like I said, I don't expect every fan or every media person to do something like that. We all have to kind of figure out on our own how we reconcile them, but it's definitely, it's difficult.
I want to go back for just a second. We've talked about these college athletes we have, and they all, of course, aspire to be professional, and we all know there's a very small percent that make that. What impact can journalism and media have on the youth who all aspire to be, famous, LeBrons and all these things, but you never hear about somebody aspiring to be a Barack Obama or a George Washington Carver or John Glenn. We never hear about those. So what can journalism do to impact that?
Right.
Balance it.
Well, the first thing I'll say is I think we have to make those numbers a lot more prevalent. The 2% that actually of D1 athletes that actually make it to the pros, I think all of us probably know that, probably because you've taken Professor Alexander's class. The other part of that statistic that I think really demonstrates how difficult that is not just that 2% make it to the pros, but 84% believe that they will. And that disparity is what causes a lot of this identity crisis that you guys were talking about, and the not necessarily being prepared for world beyond sports. As journalists, I think that I understand where you're going with that question, absolutely. And, we need to do a better job of elevating other things. I don't think that elevating athletes is the reason that every little boy aspires to be an athlete. I do think that there are actual systemic reasons that poor Black youth from certain areas of the country can only get college scholarships if they're an athlete. There's a reason that there are more Black men playing football and basketball than are playing baseball, and it's not a talent disparity. We do need to do a better job of highlighting people who have had successful careers after high school and college athletics. But that being said, there is an unspoken benefit of playing sports at whatever level that you're playing sports. One of my favorite things that Ernst & Young does every year is they put out this study where they survey the C-suite women at Fortune 500 companies. And 94% of those women have played sports in some level. And that tells you a lot. Most of those women don't think that they're going pro. But there are benefits to have playing sports that extend beyond just the prospect of pro sports. I don't really know what we can do culturally to, it's a function of where the money goes, who gets paid, frankly, but also of stardom, right? Who doesn't want to be famous? And most people aren't going to be famous sitting on a city council for 4 years until they make it to, a little bit broader politics. And just like not everybody's going to be LeBron, nobody's going to be Barack, right?
That kind of segues into my question, which is gender equity. And we talked earlier about NWSL versus MLS salaries of women professional athletes versus men. And recently Iceland passed a law that said they had to be paid the same, professional athletes, both men and women. And so it'll yet to be seen how that translates. But and then it's kind of a labor question as well. So like in this country, we have to force change or legislate change. That's not really something we like, but we also had a panel member talking about Title IX. It seems to be something that we have to educate people about. We have to force people to change. So kind of with all those things I just said, do you think that that's what needs to happen when it comes to equitable pay for women professional athletes?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be rude. I was listening, but I wanted to get the quote correct, and I haven't found it yet, but I will.
My students do it all the time.
But here's the thing. Once you get to a certain generation, we can do both. I promise you, I was listening while trying to do this. So I can't remember her name. I can't remember the exact quote. The UK the head of the UK Ministry of Sport is a woman. She's new, she's incoming. And she recently gave a speech and passed a law to increase funding for women's sports and to mandate that men's teams that have women's teams alongside them. Now, the model is different over there, especially with club soccer, but that they devote equal resources to both men and women's sports. And again, I can't remember the exact language around it, but she basically said, we're waiting for this moment where women's sports justify having this money thrown at them. They justify them just by existing, right? And the idea that it takes government intervention to help sports grow isn't unique to women's sports. I mean, I'm on this soapbox all the time, especially when I talk about the WNBA, but absolutely with the NWSL, the Women's Hockey League, CWHL, and the NWHL. Men's sports, from its infancy, always had government assistance in some way. Football had a lot of sweetheart deals in order to have the AFL and the NFL merge. And part of that deal was actually the 501c6 nonprofit status that the league office was able to claim until they gave it up a few years ago. The reason they gave it up being that they had to disclose executive pay. Baseball is still antitrust exempt. Baseball has been antitrust exempt since the 1920s. The original reason that baseball has that exemption is because even in the 1920s, the Supreme Court decided that baseball did not constitute interstate commerce. You had teams traveling across state lines. You had radio broadcasts of these games. So fine, it was the 1920s. This has been challenged in the Supreme Court twice since then. Most recently in the late 80s, I believe. It might have been the early 90s. And even then, there was too much of a precedent to, anyway, that's all a huge way of saying that there has always been a government push to help men's sports grow. And one of the only reasons that we don't have that push for women's sports is, one, because we're comparing them to men's sports, which is unfair. We can't expect the WNBA to reach the levels of the NBA yet, right? It's a 20-year-old league. Look at where the NBA was when it was 20. The NBA was broadcasting playoff games on tape delay on CBS until 1986. So the idea that we should have some kind of government intervention, I am completely in favor. But it doesn't need to necessarily come to that. I think it's really encouraging that in the UK they have ministers professing that line. But the fact of the matter is there's enough money here in the sports ownership world. It just takes owners who actually care about women's sports. I don't know if that always means female owners or female executives. It helps. It definitely helps. But that also means prioritizing the televising of these games. ESPN's doing a much better job this year than they have in years past of putting WNBA games on in primetime on ESPN. That hasn't always been the case. If you're not showing fans the product, you can't be surprised when fans aren't consuming the product. So I think that there's a confluence of things that can happen here. With soccer, like we talked about earlier, there are a lot more complicated dynamics because of the money issue, because of how little money is still in the sport in general, and because, they're still trying to grow soccer as an actual draw, as an audience draw, and not just something that, kids do, which it's not, right? But we still, listen, soccer is the biggest game in the world, and we still don't have viewership for Premier League games in the way that we should. So there are a lot of challenges there. But I do think that the government can play a huge role in this. And listen, we've had senators in the last few years put forth congressional statements, proclamations about the importance of equal pay for women athletes. And, that's all that really is a statement. And that's great for political reasons, but, let's see when that actually turns into some funding.
Thank you, Kavitha.
Yep.
I want to please give a round of applause for our speaker. I want to thank everyone for coming out and thank again our panelists. I also want to thank Tyler Johnson and Deasia Page Sergi for their introductions. I want to thank our co-sponsors, the people that have worked with us the whole time, the business school, KU Athletics, the departments of African American Studies, the departments of Health and Exercise Science. And again, I want to thank our keynote speaker who said we didn't know who she was, but I think she introduced us to herself and gave a tremendous talk and a wonderful question and answer. So thank you again, Kavitha. And I look forward to seeing everyone here next year.